morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'd like to talk to you about Victorian attitudes towards sexuality. Uh, Probably for many people, the adjective Victorian is immediately associated with sexual repression and double standards and hypocrisy. Let's see why. And to start, we need to introduce a certain theoretical um, concept, the concept of discourse, which was introduced by a 20th century philosopher of ideas, Michel Foucault, in his book. The history of sexuality. This was something he wanted to be his most important book, like the sum of his knowledge. He never finished it, but luckily for us, he started with the Victorian period, not with the ancient. Quite interestingly, he called the chapter on the Victorian period "We the Victorians." We meaning contemporary people, 20th century people. Why did he do that? He thought that the attitudes to sexuality that developed in the 19th century were still valid in the end of the 20th century, so probably they are still valid now. And they were valid through what he called the discoursification of the subject. And the discourse, as the term itself suggests, it's the manner of speaking, the way of speaking. So, who could discuss this subject in public and in what circumstances? So, Foucault believed that in Victorian culture, there were basically three kinds of people and three circumstances in which anything concerning sexuality could be discussed. And this was the medical discourse, the legal discourse, or the moral discourse. You could write and discuss about sexuality if you were a medical doctor, if you were a moralist, which normally meant somebody connected with the Church of England, or if you were a legislator, so normally you sat in Parliament. And I hope you noticed by now that these three professions were exclusively male, exclusively. Until at the very end of the 19th century, women were not allowed to study medicine. They were not admitted to parliament, and they couldn't be members of the clergy of the Church of England. So that's one thing. Only men could discuss sexuality, and they could discuss it among themselves. And these were not just any men, but your standard Victorian, middle class, educated men, so the dominant social force in everything. Those who dominated the law and the church and the sciences and medicine and journalism and so. There are quite a few books published about different matters concerning sexuality, and they are all written by middle class men for middle class men. What is perhaps most shocking, and I remember once I supervised a very interesting MA thesis on that, was that This thesis was about the medical books concerning female sexuality. They were not only all written by men, but women were never even consulted. They were treated and they were described, but they were never asked. They were never interviewed. So they were treated basically like, I don't know, the animals would be treated by a veterinary doctor. So they were the subject of the book, but not really uh, patients. And I would like to start with one of these doctors, William Acton, perhaps the most famous of these Victorian doctors writing about sexuality. He wrote a few books on this subject. The most famous, the most influential probably was the book from the 1850s called The Functions and Disorders of the Reproductive Organs. So he wrote extensively about women, never consulting them, just describing them. And I would like to give you two quotations from this book because they have really become legendary in the Victorian studies. The first one goes like this. The majority of women, happily for them is in brackets, but it's in the original text of the book. So the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. Happily for them. Um, the other quotation is like this. As a general rule, a modest woman seldom desires any sexual gratification for herself. She submits to her husband's embraces, but principally to gratify him, and, were it not for the desire of maternity, would far rather be relieved from his attentions. End of quote. So, as you can see, there's a lot going on here. So let's look at it in greater detail. So first of all, like most Victorians, Acton believed that sexuality should be confined to marriage. We talked about it a little bit when we talked about love, the concept of love in Victorian society, but of course, sexuality is something that people do in marriage. So any form of extramarital sexuality was wrong, even for a medical doctor. Of course, if we look at the moral discourse, what the clergy, the Protestant clergy were saying, they were saying the same. So that's it. Then we have the situation that men and women have very different desires, that basically women have no desires at all. They only submit to male desires because they want to please their husbands, but they do not have any sexual desires for themselves. Also, that women have the desire of maternity. So all women want to have children. They all want to be mothers. You may recall the great importance of maternity for Victorian culture, the great idealization of maternity for Victorian culture. But for this doctor, and he's not just anyone, he's a very influential doctor, this was really something that was present in all women and something that really replaced sexual desire in these women. So this is something I would like to draw your attention to, how narrow the scope of what the Victorians would consider normal sexuality. So normal sexuality would be performed within marriage between a man and a woman, husband and wife, um, for the purpose of procreation. That's it. They would probably add that these people need to be middle class, so they need to. So Victorian men, the dominant men, would basically think that they are the normal kind, and everybody else, which means women, working class, children, as you will see in a moment, and people like homosexuals, they are not normal. So you would have this kind of triple condemnation of everybody who was not considered normal. They would be seen as unhealthy, and in the 19th century, you have the classification of all kinds of diseases, including sexual perversions. So if you think of all those um, complicated names, foreign names, mostly Latin and Greek names for sexual perversions, they come from the 19th century, as most names for medical conditions. So if you were not normal, you could be ill. Or you could be a sinner. You could be a fallen woman, for example. A very popular Victorian term from the moralizing discourse, mostly referring to prostitutes, but not only the prostitutes, but also any kind of woman who, for example, did not want to marry or did not want to have children. She would be a fallen woman if she, for example, wanted to have higher education. So this makes most of you ladies Victorian perverts. And I guess that all of us, as we listen, would probably qualify as some kind of Victorian perverts, because the scope of what was normal was so narrow. And of course, the third discourse was the legal discourse. So if you did not comply with the standards of normality, you could be a criminal. You perhaps needed to be punished by the law. And we'll talk about it in a little moment on the two cases, prostitution and homosexuality. These were the aspects of sexuality that were mostly interesting for the legislators, because they could include punishment for the transgressors. But perhaps let's start with the children. Could Victorian children be seen as perverts? But of course. And Dr. Acton comes to the rescue. He spent much of his career trying to persuade his middle and upper class patients how dangerous it was when children touched themselves at night. This was something that could basically lead to their death. And before death, a whole array of diseases and problems. There was a long list in the book. Dr. Acton was not the first one, actually. He was quite popular in England, but this was a problem in continental Europe as well. So doctors believed that masturbation caused serious health problems, such as tuberculosis, madness, blindness, and of course, eventually, untimely death, especially in boys. There was a very popular medical opinion in the 19th century that the male semen was produced by the body from the blood. So it took a lot of energy from the body to produce a little bit of semen. So if the boys and men spent this semen unwisely, they were weakening their body and making it more prone to disease. So, going back to Foucault's book, he actually argues that the design of Victorian schools for boys was such as to prevent masturbation. The only reason that the boys would not have their own rooms, that they would sleep in big dormitories, that they would be occupied most of the day with physical exercises, that they would be encouraged to take cold showers, that they would be supervised most of the time, also sometimes having some sort of prefects at night guarding them, was to prevent them from touching themselves, because the medical opinion declared that this solitary vice, to use the Victorian term, could lead to an array of horrible diseases. If the boys were not at school, there were other means to save them, and one of them was a revival of something the Victorians believed, convinced themselves, was part of the medieval culture, that is chastity belts. So those metal pieces of underwear that supposedly knights going on crusades put on their wives so they would be faithful. For what we know, such contraptions were not used in the Middle Ages, but they were used in the Victorian period, and not really for girls, but for boys. They were put on at night so that the boys would not touch themselves. This is how it goes. So even children were not completely innocent. Of course, babies, little children could be seen perhaps as innocent creatures, but pubescent boys? No way. Absolutely no way. The next category of Victorian perverts. If the production of semen was weakening, and basically sex was weakening for the male body, then perhaps people who did not have sex were normal, like spinsters. Nope. And why not? Because according to the medical opinion of the Victorian period, sexual abstinence was good in men because it conserved the energy. It was not good in women because they needed to have sex with their husbands, because they needed to absorb the semen produced by the men. And if they were not getting that, this would lead to the same list of problems as masturbation in boys. So, tuberculosis, madness, blindness. One of the books on Victorian sexuality actually lists, wait for it, syphilis as one of the results of sexual abstinence in women. Victorians believed they could get syphilis from that. So spinsters, unmarried women, women who never had sex, were also not normal because they were not getting this precious fluid from the male body. So there's no way to be normal. And we continue in a moment.